Thank you everyone for joining Integrate Online today. We're going to talk about adjusting your communication strategy during COVID-19. And thank you so much for being here. I know it's a crazy time for everyone. I hope everyone is safe at home, or if you're in essential services, that you're able to do your job and stay safe. So I'm Whitney Drake. I work at General Motors in the customer experience group. And with me, I have Lindsay, who is the vice president on Edelman's corporate team. She helps clients across industries translate their business objectives and messages into compelling stories for their different stakeholders. I also have Bill Walsh, the VP of Communications at AARP, a national nonprofit consumer group with 38 million members. His team is responsible for developing communication strategy and providing support for all of AARP's social impact priorities. And Bill is also the coronavirus communications lead for AARP. So Lindsay and Bill, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Thanks.
Great. So I wanted to just kick off today. In communications and PR, we always hear, or even might have been able to put into practice, our crisis communication plans. And this seems to be a little bit different in the fact that it is ongoing with no possible end date versus something that might be a natural disaster. And so how are we helping our organizations, clients, and employees work through something long-term that's, continually shifting? I'll just start there, and maybe Bill, you could take a first crack at it, and then we'll have Lindsay chime in.
Sure. Well, thanks for that question, and thanks for having us here. This is a crisis, but it's a crisis unlike we've seen before, and it's forced us to just completely reorient our communications and marketing. And I'm talking mostly to external audiences here, our consumer audiences in particular. In normal times, we would be talking about age discrimination and family caregiving and saving for retirement and things like this. This has forced us to see everything through a new lens, and that lens, of course, is the coronavirus. We have a large content team, a few dozen people, and we've had to reevaluate all of the content that we're pushing out, as well as all of the marketing messages. You want to be both relevant to your audiences, but you also don't want to sound tone deaf. So, for example, we have member benefits around cruises and travel. We have adjusted those to be in accordance with the CDC guidelines about social distancing and avoiding crowds. And so we've had to adjust a lot of our marketing messaging as well as our content. And so I'm happy to talk more about it, but at a high level, like I say, it's forced us to really reorient all of our content and marketing.
Yeah, that's great, Bill, that those considerations are being implemented, so quickly and so well in your organization. I think generally, and Whitney, you compared this isn't a natural disaster or something that is a one-time happening, it's continuing. And a lot of times we see that organizations have a crisis, a plan in place, or something they might aim to do in the first and move forward from there. But this isn't something where we can just stop. We have to keep communicating. There's some expectation of communication in different ways. And so, that's a place where we really want to start from here.
I think that's a great example, and leads into one of the questions, which is how do we handle campaigns that maybe we were working on that are not pandemic related, and what's the level of appropriateness for continuing with those campaigns? So Lindsay, why don't you take this one, and then we'll hit Bill.
Sure. My husband and I were watching TV the other night, and I was pleasantly surprised at how much commercials had already, specifically from the automotive industry, but also local companies, had changed their TV advertising so quickly. And there's a lot of B-roll, a lot of animated words on the screen. But I was impressed to see that. I was heartened to see that, you know, but from the marketer's perspective, I was really impressed with how they'd shifted focus so quickly. You know, when we think about evaluating campaigns, it's across channels. So some people may be quiet on social media, but if your email marketing is continuing, you know, and employees may be furloughed or laid off, you know, how does that look then to your customers who are getting those email marketing messages from you? So it's really important to take a multi-channel approach to it, and to think about your tone, you know, especially with social. Bill mentioned taking some of the CDC guidelines into account, which is so important, and also thinking about, you know, how you're saying things. How might your worst critic look at the messaging you're putting out right now? Or, you know, if it's next to something in someone's social feed, that is maybe, you know, a devastating news article, how does that then come across? And you really have to kind of devil's advocate those worst case scenarios in your mind here, and look at your marketing through that eye.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good point. You know, one of our first steps was to create enterprise-wide messaging, and make sure I mean, we have 53 state offices, right? And so we had to make sure that the furthest reaches of our organization were aligned with our messaging. So nobody got out in front. Nobody said something that sounded tone deaf or insensitive. And to Lindsay's point, we took a look at all of our communications and marketing campaigns through the lens of coronavirus. I'll give you an example. You know, we do a lot on consumer fraud, and so again, in normal times, we would talk about imposter scams and stealing your social security number and credit cards. We were able to pivot that rather quickly to focus on, you know, these really bad actors out there who are peddling fake vaccines for coronavirus. And this week now, the latest is, you know, scam artists trying to get people stimulus checks, right? And so that's really high value information to our audience, you know, and our audience is an older consumer audience, but, you know, getting that pivoting is in that case isn't just about, you know, protecting the brand, it's about giving value to the end user that they can use. And so this has really had an effect in our marketing channels because, as Lindsay kind of suggested, a lot of these have been teed up for a while, and there's a real impulse, I think, for people to just continue what they're doing. You know, they're on automatic pilot. They want to continue to send out all their marketing emails and their social blasts, and we've had to pause all of that and have them reorient it to ensure that we're you know, not sounding tone deaf. And I think we've done that pretty well, but it took a while for everybody to get on board.
Yeah, I would agree. Just ensuring that whatever campaigns are going out, you're able to fulfill them and honor them, and that people are abiding by local stay-at-home guidelines. So you don't want to have a campaign telling you to run out to your nearest store if the guidelines in that market are asking you to stay at home. And just the ability to look outside of our day-to-day and be aware is huge. So I think this is great advice. I think we've covered actually a few other questions in this one, so that's awesome. I'm going to take one that I think is crucial and something that we at GM had to pivot very quickly, but how do you communicate not only externally, but with your employees in this, you know, ever-changing landscape, especially when we just got the government, we're extending through the end of April, right? So how do you make sure that you're not only communicating externally, but internally in a changing landscape? And some companies have people who can work from home, and some companies have people who can't work from home. So it's ever shifting. I'll start this one a little bit. We actually shifted, I think we're at 95% of our contact centers for GM to work from home in a matter of 2 weeks. So it was a Herculean task to be able to take customer calls. And I think, Lindsay, you talked about some of our advertising. That includes our blue button press. So for emergency response, which is deemed an essential service, we actually did make plans for those people to work from home. and they're providing not only emergency response in an accident, but they're providing help if you need essential services or essential any kind of thing that you might need in your market, like food or toilet paper, paper towel. They're helping to try to track where those things might be in the market. This is something that GM and OnStar have done in natural disasters in the past. And so we've just activated that team to continue. So just Mary gives us a weekly update on where we are and what to expect from the very top. And then obviously we're working with all of our employees in their individual jobs. So Lindsay,
I'm
maybe
curious, Whitney, how
Yeah.
you've managed to pivot your manufacturing, or have you?
So actually our manufacturing facilities are idle, except for our parts centers, which were deemed essential service to keep people on the road. And within the contact centers, we're working to help first responders, doctors, pharmacists, and the like, if they have a vehicle issue, to get their vehicle up and running. So we do still need those parts to service not only essential individuals, but fleet, so ambulances, electric power workers, those type of vehicles as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll jump in here. I mean, we were fortunate that most of our staff around the country could work remotely, and we too followed the CDC government guidelines about, staying away from the office. My office is in DC, and we're actually on lockdown. And so you have to be, an essential person to be able to even access the office. We're able to do it. We have a studio there, and so we're able to do it for satellite media tours, and we do a weekly teletown hall, but it's really just a handful of people. I'd say 98% of our staff is working remotely, and it's worked out pretty well. To the beginning of your question about internal communications, I mean, I think it's vital at this time to over communicate. I think sometimes, leadership is in a bit of a bind there. They don't want to incite, fear and panic and all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, they also want to protect the health and welfare of their staff, and so they're walking a bit of a tightrope. But I think in our case, I think our leadership has done a good job at both keeping people abreast of the operational issues, how to connect remotely if you haven't done that before, when you're coming back to work, can you go into the building and get the stuff you left, as well as trying to reassure them that, leadership is thinking about them, that they're having their best interest in mind. I think it's important to send not just information, actionable information, but also some of the maybe softer messages. People are really going stir crazy. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of uncertainty and fear. I've been saying that, we're fighting coronavirus, but we're also fighting anxiety, fear, and isolation in this country. And I think that's true for our staffs as well as our customers and constituents. So having leadership send both those types of messages, I think, in an ongoing basis, I think is really important at a time like this.
Yeah, I love hearing that, Bill, you mentioned the weekly teletown halls, and Whitney, you're getting that weekly communication as well. We're doing the same. We have weekly global town halls led by our CEO. He's actually bringing in Dr. Nabarro from the WHO. So we have a health expert on the phone who's talking a little bit both about the current situation and how we can work with our clients to communicate these changes. We're also, on the local level in our DC office, getting daily evening updates from our office GM, which has been really helpful. And he is kind of putting through some of those, what Bill called softer messages. So, congratulating teams on a job well done, sharing screenshots from a Zoom meeting where a team decided to do, crazy hat day on their team happy hour that evening. So, giving ideas to everyone, but also, our research has shown, Edelman's recent research, that people really trust their employers and they want to hear these messages. They need to hear these messages from their employers, specifically about the coronavirus. So, it's important to have that communication going. It's important for it to be authentic and be well informed by, the health organizations that are giving us trustworthy information, and just keep that frequent, honest communication communication going from an internal perspective.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm going to take a question that was submitted earlier. It's essentially, I think this happens to a lot of companies when you get in times of crisis or issue management, basically wanting everything to sound very legalese and in a textbook. So everything's written somewhat dry and specific to what legal is asking them. So I believe the question is how do we remain human, empathetic, and engaging while still trying to find the sweet spot of what legal counsel has given us?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Lindsay. That happens, and we've seen it happen in this case as well. To the point Lindsay was just making, I think it's important to remember we're talking to human beings here who need to be reassured of not just the rules and the regulations of the company, but also that the company has the employee's best interest in mind. So some of the messages, I love the example of, screenshots of Zoom meetings. I've had virtual town halls. One of our sister publications called The Girlfriend, which targets Gen X women, and you should check it out. It's really un-AARP-like. You wouldn't recognize it, but they had a quarantini after 2 weeks, which was an online happy hour, and they got some hundreds of people joining. So I think, acknowledging where people are, is really important. And oftentimes the legal language doesn't capture that. In fact, it sends the exact opposite message, I think, to staff.
Lindsay, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, I think Bill had a great answer. I think that's something that we face a lot. I especially work with corporate communications, and I think getting out of the legalese is sometimes a struggle, no matter when we're communicating. So, some of the same tactics. I think there's been a lot of great research done recently by a number of different firms, showing the need for an authentic voice, showing the need for, that personal communication. Like Bill said, we're talking to people. People are stressed right now. They have emotions. In many cases, people are feeling lonely. So, showing the need for that communication on that human level, I think can sometimes go a long way in trying to make the case with a legal team or, with a communications lead who might be hesitant.
I would also just add that's true on the external front as well. In early February, the CDC reached out to me. They wanted us to review some messaging that they had developed for older populations. And I got the thing, and it was clearly written by their lawyers, right? They were trying to get the words exactly right. And, I said, look, what people need right now, they need credible information from a credible source, but you got to talk to them in a way they can understand. What we're seeing so much of are, the government's putting out guidelines about travel, about staying at home, about staying safe, and that's all great. As long as it's based on the science. But I think people sometimes have a hard time interpreting those one-size-fits-all guidelines to their own lives. We've been, like I mentioned earlier, we've been doing this weekly teletown hall, and we're getting like 70, 80,000 people attending, and they all have questions that are addressed by the guidelines. Yes, CDC, I understand you're telling me to social distance, but should I go to my brother-in-law's house tomorrow? Or I know you're telling me not to travel, but I've had this vacation on the books for a while. So there's a real need, I think, to help translate some of this dry, one-size-fits-all, often legalistic admonitions from the government into terms people can understand when they're under stress, they're confused, and there's just a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, that's a role we're trying to play every day.
I think the other thing, this was advice that I got early in my career, and I think it actually came from one of our legal teams. The legal teams provide counsel. They're assessing the risk to the company. So if you're able to rewrite it in a way that meets their guidelines and reduces your risk, then as communicators, we should feel that take that as an opportunity to rewrite it in a way that's, to Bill's point and Lindsay's point, meaningful and empathetic, and then run it by them again. When I first worked on social media, if we had written everything the way legal wanted us to, we would have never been successful in the social space. We had to, go back and forth and say, this isn't how people talk in this space. So I think it's an opportunity to really use our creative writing skills to come back and take the guidelines, but make them in a way that people understand it and it's empathetic. So I think it's a great question and a great opportunity as practitioners. So it's awesome. I want to take a minute. If you want to message me any questions, we can do that. If you would like to unmute and ask a question, we can do that, whichever you guys prefer. So I'm going to give a minute here if someone wants to unmute and ask a question. I know we might have a little bit of talking over each other, but let's just give it a whirl. And if not, I have another question to follow up on. So are there any questions out there?
Hi, I'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Carissa.
No problem. So as we are adapting to the changes that are happening right now, there are murmurs about the way that this is going to affect long-term business execution. So when we're talking about the marketing communications realm, what do you think are going to be the long-term takeaways for what this pandemic and the way that we've had to operate will end up being? Anything in your particular businesses that you think might hang around?
Bill, you want to go first?
I was going to invite you to jump in. Maybe Whitney, you want to take a crack at this?
Sure.
You have some marketing communications concerns.
Yeah. So I think it's actually going to change the way that we do business in multiple facets. I'll take the place where I work right now. So customer experience, generally speaking, customer experience and customer advisors have always worked in a site with a very structured process and team leads, and in the locale and location vicinity has been very important. What this model is proving to us, which other companies have done, I think UPS has a work from home model for their advisors, is that we can potentially move to a work from home model more successfully than maybe we thought in the past. So I think it's going to have an impact on the way we do business, the types of businesses we do, and then ultimately how do we remarket after this, because it's a historic event. I hate to say that, but it really is. It's going to change people's perspective. I have read a lot of research and we've talked a lot about how we will come out of this and people are resilient, but I do think the way we do business, even for us from a marketing perspective, our shop, click, drive, which is where you go online to shop, has been a big component of the work that we have done in the past few years. And in this time when you can't go necessarily visit a dealer, it's becoming even more important. So I do think it's going to have a shift in the way we market and do business.
I'll jump in. I can think of a lot of changes. I'll mention one internal, one external. Internal, and this is picking up on something Lindsay said at the outset, it's forcing us already to rethink how we manage crises. We have, like a lot of companies, a standing crisis management team. We do, scenario planning and wargaming all the time. I've been on those in those groups, and what I'm thinking about now is how almost every scenario they threw at us was a short-term thing, right? And we've managed through it in a week or two. It hasn't been a crisis without end. And so I think our internal machinery is going to have to adapt to that, both in terms of how employees work every day, but how we just stay in touch with each other, how leadership is communicating with everybody, et cetera. Externally, we've relied a lot on our print publications to communicate with our members. The magazine we send out is the highest circulating magazine in the country, higher than People magazine. This is not the time to get information out through print publications. Our deadlines are months in advance, and we were having to, at the 11th hour, insert content to try to make those publications feel relevant. The crisis has forced us to rely more than ever on our digital platforms, which are really robust, but because the nature of the landscape is changing so quickly, we're having to update our content several times a day just to make it feel relevant, to make it accurate. We're relying on multi-channel communication strategy that involves publications for sure, but also our newsletters, social, our app, our podcasts, and we've been very aggressive, maybe more than ever, with earned media. Within the first few weeks of the crisis, we did 2 satellite media tours, which got enormous attention. And so it's forced us also to rethink how we're delivering our messages in a real time or in a just-in-time way.
Great, thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, I think similar to what Bill said, like I'm very interested to see how virtualization continues to kind of transform how we're working, how people are learning, how we're getting together with our friends. I mean, I'm having Zoom meetings with friends now and Google Hangouts with friends who I might normally have, had a phone call. We're playing games together. We've never done that before. So I think there are some great opportunities, and I'm curious to see how that continues, once things have returned to normal, as much as we can say that they may eventually return to normal. From a communications perspective, I think that's really interesting. And then just from a broader societal perspective, what have we been doing in person that might be better, whether for the environment, for our health, for our mental well-being, to be done virtually in the future? Are we going to see conferences that move virtual, remaining virtual in years to come? I'm just really interested to see some of those longer term effects also.
That's great. All right, I have one question that was submitted. Government contractors do a lot of technology related work, and they're somewhat immune to this because they're off-site. And they want to know if they can announce and promote contract awards, new hires. Is it appropriate to continue to talk through those, promoting the ways technology companies have adapted to keep serving its government customers while keeping its staff working from home?
It's a good question. It's definitely not, I think, not exclusive to government. There's a lot of, professional services and other industries where everyone's set up to work remotely, and it is, business as usual to some extent. I think it's great that hiring is continuing, and contracts are continuing to be won. How is it that information is being promoted? It seems to be the question. So I would think about maybe a human lens that can be positioned through. Hear from the new hire themselves, a profile of them, and maybe it's something from the head of HR, and it's on a more monthly basis instead of promotion. They're hires announced every week. Maybe it's monthly, and it's we're proud to be able to continue to support our customers during times like these. Messaging more along those lines. And in terms of what the organization is doing, I think it's the same. Instead of promoting what you're doing and how you're investing, is it tips that you can provide other contractors or other organizations who might be in a similar boat? That way you're still kind of getting some of that thought leadership benefit out there, but it's being done more in a way like learn from what we're doing, as opposed to let me tell you what we're doing, let me show you.
Yeah, and exactly, and not bragging about it, right? I mean, I think right, what that question gets at really is tonality, and you don't want to be in a position of crowing about what an opportunity this is for your company and how you're perfectly situated. That's going to turn people off with surprise. But I like the term that Lindsay used. We're proud to be able to continue to serve our customers, and here's how we're doing it. And I love the idea about sharing best practices, things they've discovered that they're passing along. We're getting a lot of that ourselves, and it's been really helpful. The other suggestion I would make is for contractors in particular is to look at your clients and see how you can help them in the moment, right? We've had a number reach out to us with, just this morning I had one that is proposing to build a tool within like 48 hours that can calculate your are you eligible for a stimulus check? How much? If you're not, what other resources are available? That's a high value thing to consumers when there's so much confusion around what was in that $2 trillion package. And that is a credit to that contract. They were thinking of the client. They were thinking, how does the client need to help their customers? They came up with a solution, and so we're looking at it.
That's great. Thank you. This one was asked about the Medicaid community and development, but I think it applies to everyone. So a lot of their work is based on in-person events and meetings, building partnerships and relationships to grow membership. What would be some suggestions to continue that work in this critical period of time when you might not be able to forge those relationships? And I think, Lindsay, you touched on it, which is finding a different way to build relationships, right? In the past, we might have gone out to dinner or for coffee. And so what are the ways we try to facilitate that now virtually, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a place for brands, organizations, agencies to be that facilitator. Social media is I think a great way to do that, but you really have to keep your audience in mind and what the goal is that you want to get out of it. Maybe social media isn't the best bet for you. Bill, I'm sure this is something that AARP is dealing with right now in terms of, you're doing the teletown halls, I think is a great idea. What else have you seen there?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you have to keep your audience in mind, right? And so for some, they'll crank up Zoom or Skype, FaceTime without a problem. For many of our constituents, it is. I mean, we're having to create videos about how to work Skype, right? But someone has to get to the videos first. And so I think you have to think about your audience and how they can and want to receive the messages to stay in touch. Yeah, I mean, we launched these teletown halls in early March, really as a way, to give our older members a way to use the telephone to call and chat with these, top federal health experts or people from Social Security or the Federal Trade Commission or whatever it is. And they've been really popular, I think, because that channel works for that audience. So I think it's about looking at your audience, figuring out a best channel, but it's also about the content, right? I mean, if you can be offering people something of value in this moment, I'm not talking about giveaways or products or anything like this, but information, high value information, I think that's going to draw people to whatever communication channel that you devise.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add, working with the media, one of the things that we found, and I know there's a lot of separation between your professional life and your personal life, but understanding potentially the client's personal life and maybe what they're doing, like are they homeschooling and things like that, might give you an opportunity to change the conversation from just business to what's going on and being more sensitive to the fact that we all have multiple lives we're living right now. I have twins. My dog, who's 7 months old, just busted in on my Zoom and tried to make a guest appearance. So, being able to make the conversations personal while still doing business in this time, I think is something we all should consider. So I'm going to move on to another question because there are some really good ones here, but I think I'm going to tie two of them together, which is how do you strike the right balance between acknowledging our new reality, not dwelling on it. And then I think I'm going to extend that into someone who was asking specifically about the travel industry. Is it too early to try to be talking about summer travel plans? And I think that's part of this balance of reality and dwelling on it just because we don't know. So Lindsay, you want to take a crack at this one?
Yeah, I mean, tone is always a tricky thing. And I think you have to, your brand voice, your brand values really come into play here. And so, yeah, you don't want to be negative, but this is people's reality. And I think if you don't acknowledge that, you risk turning them off or losing them entirely. And so, um, communicating less frequently is an option that I've seen a lot of brands start to take. Brands that are typically quite vocal and send out a lot of communications are maybe sharing fewer communications each day or each week. And so, thinking about your content cadence allows you to maybe be consistent, strike a good tone, because you're just not having to publish as often. And so that's certainly something you can do to start as you try to figure that out. I think in certain industries like travel, it's going to look entirely different. For me personally, I would love to get back to planning my summer travel, but I don't know if that's realistic. So, I am looking at some of those emails and some of those messages. I'll give a specific example from Celebrity Cruises, who I get their emails. They had an email that went out, I think it was last week, or maybe the week prior, that acknowledged the current situation that they're in and said, where are you in your thought process right now about your next vacation? Are you eager to keep hearing our news and get excited for when you're planning? Are you still maybe a few months from thinking about that? Or are you just not wanting to hear about it at all? And based on what button you clicked, I assume it automatically updated some setting on their back end. I clicked the middle button and they said, great, you're not gonna get emails from us for another couple of months. Which I thought was really smart. Again, I don't necessarily know their audience strategy or their content strategy or what their goal was, but for me, just on the consumer side, I felt like they were paying attention to the fact that I really didn't need to be hearing about my cruising options, every day for the next couple of months. And so I appreciated them putting that power in my hands.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to give anyone travel advice because we too are trying to figure out what to do with our own plans. But one thing we've noticed, because we do a lot of content about the travel industry, we have a whole travel site with discounts for members, et cetera. But what we've noticed is that the providers, the carriers, hotels, that are trying to really be as flexible as possible these days. They don't want to be the company that gets called out for taking somebody's deposit because of the coronavirus. And so I think they're making it easy for us to be flexible, which is what we have to be at this point, right? In terms of content, Whitney, you're right. I think people are getting huge doses of reality, and I think it's contributing to their stress and anxiety and feelings of isolation. We've tried to offer some lighter content. For example, Denise Austin, exercise guru, cut 6 videos for us. So we're helping people exercise in their own homes. We have some guidance about just how to stay connected with friends and family. We're trying to lean a little bit into the lighter side because we understand people are really feeling a lot of pressure these days and they need some sort of release.
Yeah, we did something similar with Show Us Your Vehicle at Home. So yeah, there's not a typical thing we would ask, but your vehicle's at home. In many markets, you've been asked to stay at home, so share it with us, right? So I think it's a great point to find the balance.
I love that.
Yeah, I think there's another question here I want to talk to, which I think is fairly important, which there's a fact that's cited in it. I don't have the actual source, but I'm still going to use it, which is 40% of residents in rural areas of the US, or about 23.4 million people, lack access to high-speed internet.
Yeah. And
this actually has come up in Michigan because of our homeschool initiative and some school districts not actually being able to the families being able to fulfill it because you need access to computers and internet. So the question is, how do we ensure we're still connecting in those markets? And I know, Bill, you touched on magazines because of the long lead time, but I do think direct mail is an option. So I thought maybe if you guys want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was going to bring this up earlier because, this is being sponsored by West Virginia University, and that's a huge issue in West Virginia, and one that our state office has been fighting for a long time to increase broadband access to remote areas. It's true in rural areas around the country. And it's why, during a crisis like this, I think you have to look at a variety of communications channels. I've mentioned the teletown halls, but yeah, we've done direct mail. It's limited because the space is limited, right? But you can at least reassure people that you're on the case, tell them what you're doing, that you're advocating for them in the state legislature and in Congress. We also are having state teletown halls. Our state offices have, like 36 of these things teed up over the next few weeks, and that allows them to ask a question. In West Virginia, we had the governor on last week. Next week, we're having Senator Joe Manchin. So this gives folks who have limited internet access direct access to the decision makers.
Great. Lindsay, did you have anything you wanted to add, or some other questions?
No.
Okay.
That was great.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the questions is B2B. So particularly for health plans, we're experiencing a ton of change and we want to be mindful of the current situation. So are there any best practices for B2B communications during this time?
Yeah, B2B is another area where, you're talking to people, and yes, it's a purchase decision maker, but it's also someone who might have their kids at home and they're homeschooling and they're trying to get their work done in between. And so I think, that the point that Whitney made earlier about really that personal communication, I think that's always important in B2B comms, but especially during times like this right now. I think the sales and the thought leadership line can always be a tricky one, but that needs to be walked especially carefully. Now is not the time to be selling. But Bill gave an example of a partner who reached out in a positive way and brought a solution that can be helpful. So how do you provide those best practices, those examples, those ways that you can help without selling? And it may involve going back and looking at some of the communications that you had planned and making sure that they are more so on the helpful leadership line versus the selling line.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you. I think the next question I'll try and hit, and then I'm just checking with Stephanie on our time, but how do we continue to work through this changing landscape in terms of new hires, potential layoffs, and then just even interviewing process? And I think a lot of it, very heavily on communications. So if you guys want to touch on,
yeah.
I can start with interviewing, because
Sure.
we've actually moved to a different model, if it helps. So we've actually moved to a model where you are going through a series of questionnaires, and then your first discussion with our HR team is by video, and we record it, and then it is shared with our staff. And then the second model, which would be with the hiring team, is also done by video. So we've moved to a completely virtual interviewing process. So if the company you're working with hasn't done that, it's something probably to start looking at. It also saves on cost in the long term. So even though we're doing it now because of being at home, it's something to look at in a longer term lens.
Yeah, we've made a similar pivot. This crisis has slowed down a lot of things, but not the hiring process at our shop. And so we're doing many of the things that Whitney described, including virtual onboarding for new staff. This is something that we would normally hold, all day session and throw, 20 different speakers at these poor people and try to run them off to make sure they actually want to work for us. But our HR department has pivoted and developed an online onboarding. Look, it's just not as effective at meeting the leaders of the organization in person, but that'll come eventually. We just didn't want to put a stop to everything. We wanted to keep the the hiring machine moving as much as possible during the crisis.
Yeah, we've done the same. We actually have a new employee on our team who started yesterday. So she's getting the virtual onboarding experience, and everyone's excited for our regular afternoon team gathering today to say hello to her in person over Zoom for the first time. So I think it will be interesting to see, Whitney, like you said, from a cost efficiency perspective, like will some of these things continue on once people are back in the office together in person? In terms of communicating about these things, also, I would just say, keeping that empathy and that authenticity in mind. Edelman released something, I think, at the end of last week about the CEO as Chief Empathy Officer during this time, which I thought was really interesting. When a lot of these announcements are coming from executives and from the C-suite, I'm just thinking of it from that perspective and making sure that the humanity and the authenticity is there. It goes a long way.
That's awesome. So one of the questions was just regarding metrics, and obviously in times like this, we're seeing a very big shift in our metrics and not really having anything historical to measure. So we might have seen seasonality in our metrics, or we might have seen business requirements. And so I'm going to move the question into like, how do we work with our clients and our executives to understand that the metrics are going to shift and that it's going to take us a little bit of time probably to get our arms around what they really mean. So can you guys talk a little bit about how we're coaching to ever evolving metric sets that maybe we've never seen before?
I can weigh in on this. I mean, early on, it was evident to us that we're having to stop a lot of things that we do, in-person events, for example, around the country, which are a source of some of our metrics. We measure number of people engaged, and we have ways of kind of teasing out the social mission benefit of some of our training programs, for example, our meal packing and all these sorts of things. And leadership was, they were the ones who made the calls about stopping those. And so the next question was, well, what about, what are we counting now? And we have, an enterprise dashboard that we're aiming for, and suddenly we're going to be taking a hit in a variety of different ways. And so they've been very open to the notion of reassessing what those metrics are going to be. But there are also opportunities, right? I mean, I think it's smart to think, well, okay, we're in the middle of a crisis. Maybe there's some different metrics we should be holding ourselves to. And for us, we're thinking a lot about, getting good information in people's hands. How many people are attending virtual events that we're putting on. We've pivoted to virtual events for, our tax aid program and a whole host of things that we're doing. And so I think with some creativity, you can think about other ways that you can demonstrate business success in the midst of the coronavirus, and just have to, I think, well, at least in my case, our executives have been open to the notion of reassessing the metrics for success.
That's great. Yeah, I think shifting how you're defining success, like Bill said, is definitely key. And then also, when we do look at things on a year-long basis, yeah, there's going to need to be maybe an explanation for the spike or the decrease in certain metrics. But that happens all the time. There's always something random that goes on that you need to explain after the fact. So, this will be something that next year we'll talk about and say, well, how do we adjust now? How do we come back from that? Or how do we continue to take advantage of the increase in people attending our virtual events that we've never had before, whatever it may be. So I love the idea of using it as an opportunity and positive.
Yeah, we're using it as an opportunity to try to isolate metrics that we haven't had a chance to isolate in the past. So if we want to change one variable and see what happens, we're using this as an opportunity to do that and see what the impact is versus having to change everything all at once. And this is the last question I think we're going to have time to, but since everything is different and it's unprecedented times, is it a time to experiment and try new things? And so I'll let you guys chime in on that one.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is related to the previous question, right? There's something in when I was in business school, they used to talk about a lot, which was a normalcy bias. People want things to operate the way they expect them to operate. And in a crisis, oftentimes people are slow to make that pivot that things aren't normal. Therefore, your everyday work can't always be normal. And so it took, I think, many companies weeks to kind of realize that they were experiencing the normalcy bias and really embrace the challenge of the crisis. And we don't want to be talking about this as an opportunity, but I think it's forced companies to think creatively. So for example, last week, we just launched a new tool that helps people plug into mutual aid groups around the country, right in their community, down to the zip code level. And this is something we wasn't on our radar at all, but because we knew people were homebound and looking for delivery services or connecting with someone who can do their taxes or something like this, we moved within, it was a week, we built the site and launched it. And, so I think that's an example of how this crisis has forced us to adapt to the new landscape. So, the metrics we had before, the measures of performance we had before have to be reevaluated. And now we're measuring ourselves, or we'll have to measure ourselves on some slightly different metrics, but that's not a bad thing. It's forcing us to be more nimble, understand what our clients, in this case, consumers, really need in the moment and give them tangible value, not just information. Information's important. They want actionable tools, actionable resources. I need it and I want it now. So that's forced us to try to come up with ways for delivering those things.
Yeah, being creative with your processes and your outcomes, I think, is absolutely key at a time like this. Is it the time to take a big risk with your brand voice? Maybe not so much. I'm usually a little bit more measured or a little bit more calculated there. I think a lot of clients and organizations are wanting to err a little bit on the side of caution. But in terms of your back-end project management processes, new tools that you're launching, new metrics, new ideas for communicating, yes, definitely. However you can reach your audiences at this point, I would say take it and run with it.
Awesome. With that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Appreciate everyone joining us for Integrate Online today. I want to thank Bill and Lindsay, particularly given what a crazy time we're all in, for joining us and making the time to do this. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and please be safe, stay home, and follow your local guidelines so that we can do this again in the future.
Thank you, Whitney.
All right, stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.